Hi everybody,
Hello.
happy July.
It's July already.
I know, it's such a glorious day here. I hope some of you who have had hot weather in the Pacific Northwest are finally cooling off.
We wish we could send the
bit.
breezes back your way.
Yeah, so
Breezes in the rain that we have here.
yeah, so we're going to talk today about yarn dyes.
Yarn dyes.
Yeah, and we've already gotten some questions. So if you're just joining us and you want to talk about yarn dyes, leave us some questions in the comment section and we'll get right to them.
Yeah. And it looks like...
Does it look like it's looking like it's the wheel is slow? Let's see. Okay, so I think we're finally here.
Yeah.
So yarn dyes is the
Yarn
topic,
dyes. And thanks for the questions that some of you sent in advance. That's always helpful for us because we've got a studio full of fabric to prepare to answer your questions.
So I think the first thing that would be good to talk about was to explain. Let's kind of review different genres of fabric so we can differentiate prints and batiks and yarn dyes.
That's a good approach.
You want to start with
Sure.
prints?
So when you go to the quilt shop, probably 90% at least of the fabrics in there are prints. And a print is starts out with a high quality, this is the back, cotton. And that's called a gray good. It's spelled G-R-E-I-G-E. So it's very odd when people see it for the first time, they think, am I supposed to say grayish? But it's said gray, like the color gray. And when you go to a quilt shop, an independent quilt shop, you'll have really good quality cotton. It starts with good quality gray goods. And a print is a series of dyes that are printed that bond chemically with that cotton. So in a fabric like this, you have many different colors that are printed one at a time.
One screen at a time.
One screen at a time. And in general, prints have between one color up to usually a maximum of 16, sometimes 18 colors. So that's the staple of the quilt shop, the print.
And I think it's important to just sort of remind people that the quality of the fabric isn't just, some people think of its thread count, but it's also the quality of the dye and the chemical process, the way it adheres to the fabric, and that's what creates fading or non-fading. So
yeah, and just
that's
and durability.
Right.
So
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, go ahead for the next one.
So batiks are, sometimes they're printed kind of faux batiks, but true batiks usually have a wax resist, then it's then dyed in a variety of ways. And one of the ways to tell whether it's a real batik or a faux batik is to see whether it looks the same on both sides. Because you can definitely tell with prints that it's really different on one side than the other.
And batiks, one other thing to realize is because they are done with a wax resist technique and immersed in a dye bath, you have irregularity. With print, every yard will look exactly the same. With a batik, no 2 yards, even on the same bolt, will be exactly the same.
Because it's a dip dye.
Because it's a dip dye, and usually the print is put on by hand, sometimes by machine, but often by hand with wax resist. The other thing to keep in mind is because of the dyeing process, batiks are usually prepared on a denser, tighter weave cotton. So even though the quality of a print is really good, you're going to have a finer cotton, thinner threads, tighter weave. So batiks are actually they're great for almost everything. They're a little trickier to work with curves because they don't have as much bias or flex.
Well, also they're less consistent.
And they're less consistent.
So the way that you use them in a quilt, if you're trying to plan your colors, you know, depending, if you have a 2-inch piece here, you might get green and you might get pink, and sometimes you can have figure ground issues with that. But let's get on to yarn dyes.
So that's the background of prints and batiks. So now the yarn dyes, which we love. We just, and actually I want to say, we love these all and we love mixing them. Yes, you can mix these.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
So yarn dyes are a category.
Yeah.
And within that category, you'll hear words like shot cotton and homespun. And typically, those refer to, it's a type of yarn dye in which, well, let me back up. The yarn dye refers to, instead of printing the design on the gray goods,
or dyeing the entire cotton the way batiks are done.
Then what the way that the pattern is created in true yarn dyes is that each individual thread is dyed before it's woven. So that's a very different process.
Yeah, and these will often be referred to in the industry as loomed because they're woven on a giant loom, commercial looms.
And you can see, if I put it up, let's see, that each thread is a different color. So in this case, there's 2 colors in this
White or red.
But there might be 4 different ones in this one, for example. These are all from our Warp and
Or
Weft
actually,
line.
if you pick that one up at the
right.
top, I'll hold this
This is
forward.
our Warp and Weft 2 bundle.
So here you have something that's been loomed from, I can't remember, maybe we have a dozen colors that we spec'd for this.
And we actually design thread by thread. You know, that's...
we basically select the colors that will be, the threads are then dyed, and then the patterns in which they're dyed. Very often you'll see fake plaids and stripes that are printed rather than woven, and you can still use those, but they're
not going to wear the same way
as a yarn dye will. But there's there are a lot of faux wovens on the market, so just it helps to know what's what.
Yeah, to make sure you understand what you're getting, because one of the benefits of true yarn dyes is that they're the same on the front and back.
Yes.
So you don't have to worry about getting the right side up.
I will make one little comment about this. Yarn dyes are the same on the front and the back, but when they're woven on these giant commercial looms, and think of the thousands of threads you have going on in a factory like that. If a thread happens to break during the weaving process, the weaver will tie a tiny knot and continue the weaving. So one side, the side facing up as it's woven, may occasionally have a tiny knot in it. So when you're feeling your yarn dyes, in most cases, both sides are identical, but if there happened to be a thread breakage, any or all of those knots would be on the same side. I personally don't worry so much about it. I've sewn plenty of quilts where I've accidentally had a little knot facing up, and I don't worry about it. It's fabric. But if it's of concern to you, just feel the fabric. You'll easily feel, or turn it over. Yeah. And I will say, you won't see this in the shop, but when fabrics are woven at the mill, they're shipped with a sticker that says face side. And the face side is the side that does not have any knots. But, of all the yarn dyes we've used, maybe I see one little knot every few yards. So it's not a big deal.
But the face side sticker is for the people who are wrapping it around the bolt.
The bolt.
So they know what side to put out.
But that's not on anything when it gets to you.
Yeah, when it gets to you.
And
so
yeah, it's the... Go ahead.
So we hadn't... Benartex, I think, hadn't done yarn dyes.
20 years.
Yeah, I thought it was like 20 years. And when we asked them to start doing yarn dyes, we sent them a piece of cardstock with, what are they, like 17 or 18 different
samples
of what we thought were good quality and not worth doing, that we didn't want to put our name on.
We've seen a lot of woven yarn dyes in shops over the years that are absolutely stunning, but there are also some that are either not densely enough woven, or the threads are too fine, or they're too heavy. And those fabrics would be great for certain kinds of apparel, but for quilting, you want the fabric, whether it's a print or a batik or a yarn dye, to be within 10% of each other. They don't have to be exactly the same, but you want them to wear consistently across the quilt, because we mix fabrics.
And so I think we'd started to talk about this when we froze the first time, so I'm just going to go back over it. But the general category is yarn dyes, and then underneath that, you'll hear words like shot cottons or homespuns.
Or chambrays.
Well, shot cottons and homespuns typically refer to the quality of the threads. And when I say quality, I don't mean good or bad, I just mean the way it's been manufactured. So thread on shot cotton or a homespun might not be as consistent.
They have a little nub to it.
Yeah, it might not be as consistent, and as a result, it can't be woven quite as tightly. So under that category of yarn dyes, there's the shot cottons and the homespuns that refer to the slightly nubbier, often like K-Facet has, yarn shot cottons. Then there's also chambrays, in which there's usually, although sometimes, there's white is used in, it's usually as the warp,
undyed.
right? Undyed.
With chambray, usually you have undyed warp, kind of natural color, and then the weft, which goes across on the loom, is dyed. So basically one of the threads has color and one doesn't. Although with some contemporary manufacturers, they switch the direction of the warp and the weft.
So this is an example. I don't know if you can see that grayish green fabric is a chambray, and that's also under this umbrella of yarn dyes. You'll also hear the term cross dyes, which means that unlike the chambray, where one of the threads is white, there might be two different colors woven together.
Yeah, so you often see fabrics that may look a little iridescent even, where you have, say, a coral weft and a peach warp. So when they're woven together, it gives you a beautiful pinkish orange. The challenge with those is if you rotate the fabric, it looks like a slightly different color. So when you're using those in a quilt, you often have to pay attention to the orientation that you cut your pieces in and you use them, especially if you have blocks and you're going to have seams. There can be a slight difference there.
So one of the questions that we had was about how to buy quality yarn dyes. And I think that I can just tell you the way that I do it is I hold it up and see if I can see any other colors through it.
Well, you'll always see a little bit through any fabric, but
if you see, if I hold this up against the light, I can see the shadow of my hand, but I can't see the color of my hand. And so if I hold any of our warp and wefts up over our cutting mat, I can't see the cutting mat.
Yeah.
So that is my litmus test. I
think that's a very, very good one. And as I said before, we had the weird technical glitches. There are some beautiful yarn dyes that are more intended for the apparel market that are kind of a little see-through. And I would, in most of those cases, you can actually see color through that. And I'd steer clear of those for quilting just because they won't wear as well.
And it's not just to me that they won't wear as well, is that some of those yarn dyes that are very popular and have big designer names attached to them. When you're cutting them and working with them, especially if you don't pre-wash and you don't pre-shrink, they stretch a lot.
They stretch, they ravel.
And they're not the same weight as quilting cotton. So we were extremely picky when we were talking to Benartex about this quality, that it had to perform the same way the prints do, or else it was going to create, it wasn't going to be pleasant for you to work with.
Yeah.
Okay, so at least we've got a few people here. So,
Yeah.
okay, we seem to be
And
not glitchy anymore.
Kitty Ann, I see your comment. I'm glad you like that. The quilt we showed is called Intrepid Traveler.
Yeah, this one.
And that's from our Rediscovering Your Stash publication. It's such a great way to use up scraps, basically pairing
or fabrics,
collections.
Fabrics that you, I mean, this is totally from our stash from Indonesian, Japanese, a variety of principally Asian sources, yeah, which you know, they have more of a handmade quality as opposed to prints, but you can obviously use them today. Oh, Facebook was not our friend earlier. I hope it's our friend now. Susan, let us know if you can.
If it's still glitchy.
Yeah, if it's still glitchy. But
it says we have like a speedy connection on this end, so I don't know.
So we're going to keep going, and we will post the entire thing later on Facebook and on YouTube.
So if it's glitchy and driving you crazy, come back later and watch the full recording.
Yeah, but you can certainly leave your questions below, and we'll get to them, even if you can't hear. So within the category of yarn dyes, there are different weaves that are used to explain the patterns created. Mm-hmm. So there's things like, ginghams and stripes and plaids.
Well, yeah, let's actually just show a few. So if we're looking at stripes, what could be simpler than that? It can be 2 or more colors in an alternating pattern, very straightforward.
Or you can see kind of more complex plaids that have maybe 4 colors, and some of the bands are wider and some of them are thinner, and those are all things that we design to create different looks.
Mm-hmm. And gingham is just going to be across where you have generally the same pattern going vertically and horizontally, and usually that's done in 2 colors. When it's larger, it's often referred to as a buffalo check. There's a
big buffalo check.
A big buffalo check. We love the mini gingham because we've done
versatile.
mini ginghams in. Actually, here I'll show you. This is from our pretty. Warp and Weft too. We've got kind of purple and lilac. Oops. We've got some deep greens. We've got some lime greens.
Orange.
And what's nice about the mini gingham is it can work almost like a tone on tone, but it adds a bit more texture, and there's something about, I think, about wovens that just feel familiar. It's kind of like an old shirt.
It's homey.
It's very comfortable, and so I think it adds there's a human touch to it. There's something about you really feel the cotton in a great way, especially when they're high quality wovens.
Yes, and so we have just added to our website our new Warp and Weft holiday line, which works for a variety of holidays, from Valentine's Day to St. Patrick's Day to patriotic holidays to Christmas and Hanukkah. So there are
actually, if you
variety.
grab the quilt right on top, we have a kit and a download pattern on our website right now.
This is our Spirit, right in time for the 4th of July.
Spirit, and if you look at this up close, you can see it blends a plaid, a mini gingham, and stripes. And what's really fun about this is it's a way of incorporating the bright brightness of white that's in the wovens without it being shockingly white. It makes it very clean and crisp. And oh, it feels good.
Right. And so one of the questions we had gotten on social media, do we need to deal with this question here?
Oh, okay.
Now Facebook is telling us that they're having a problem, but let's just keep going.
We're going to keep going, yeah.
So one of the things that we wanted to do was answer the questions that we had gotten on social media. And the first one was in buying quality, and we've talked about that. And another one was washing, pre-washing. And I think that...
Please.
Yeah, pre-washing yarn dyes is even more important than prints, because when you have screen printed, the fabric is a little bit more rigid because the dye is put on top, and it's kind of like...
There's pressure added.
Yeah, it holds the threads together in a way that yarn dyes don't. And ours, we have not had any bleeding or anything with ours, but I do think it's desirable to shrink it as much as possible before you start working with it.
The Benertex, the mill that Benertex uses has had really good stable dyes for us. But no matter where we buy from, the idea of pre-washing to help lock those fibers together is just a good one.
So if you haven't seen our YouTube tutorial on pre-washing, there's actually 2 parts. We were very thorough in the pre-washing video, talking about general fabrics and then in one, and then finished quilts and rattan and synthropol and all of that in another. So we use the Ivory dishwashing liquid, about a half a teaspoon in a front-loading machine, and just depending, you don't need very much. You just need a little bit. So less is better.
Because the fabric's not dirty per se. You're just trying to rinse, flush any agents, anything excess that was in it.
There's often...
Even dust from the quilt shop, if it's been sitting on a shelf.
And there's often surfacing... surfactants, but the packaging, they put chemicals on it to be able to keep it smooth, and when they're packaging and everything. So you want to get all of that out. And even more so with yarn dyes to me than prints for that reason. But we have found that our warp and weft fabrics shrink at the same rate as our prints, which was really important.
That's
for us
something
as well.
to be careful of. If we like mixing wovens and prints, I remember making a quilt with some lesser quality wovens once, where we had made a bunch of blocks mixing prints and wovens, and the wovens shrunk at a higher rate, and that distorted the blocks. When we started working with Benertex to do our premium yarn dyes, one of the first things we did was wash a square yard of all of the wovens with square yards of the prints from Benertex, measured before and after, and got the same shrinkage rate. So at that point, we knew the quality was good and we were comfortable working with that mill.
But our Katsura quilt is a good example where we mix yarn dyes and prints together, and you can see that they look fantastic together. And I actually think that scrappy quilts are really improved by including yarn dyes with the prints.
If you're doing any sort of scrappy quilt, I would encourage you to throw in, let's say you have 50 fabrics in the scrappy quilt, use 10% of those at least as wovens, and it'll just it adds to the depth, the sense of texture, and
the scrappiness of it.
And the scrappiness. And the reality is, when you have wovens that are different colors woven together, there is more depth to the color because the light hits it differently. Prints are beautiful, but everything is on a flat surface.
So then we also have other quilts like our Color Blast quilt that is all, there's no solids used at all. It's all
And no prints.
And no prints. And then we use the buffalo check on the back, which is so fun. But one of the things that people have called and asked us about, and I'm going to grab a bolt to explain this, because this is helpful to know when you're buying. I tried to explain to one quilter who called because she was unhappy that her cuts weren't exactly along the weave. And the way fabrics, you can see the way that fabrics are woven or wound on the bolts isn't always 100% straight.
And this isn't just wovens, this is prints too. It's just, if you have a high contrast woven,
fabric.
You're going to see it more, but it's exactly the same in prints. And it has to do with the way that
The centrifugal force, right?
Yeah, the fabric is shipped to the US on long tubes. And then it goes to a place called a double enroller, which takes the big tubes, folds them in half, and winds them onto the bolts at incredibly high speeds. You have a great video of this somewhere.
Yeah, on our Facebook page.
Yeah. And when that happens, it pulls diagonally on the fabric, and it does distort it a bit as it goes on the bolt. It happens with every single fabric.
And in our kits, we try to account for the fact that you might get a piece of fabric that looks like this, where it's not. And I've had people say, well, you know, at my quilt shop, they tear or they rip. So it rips along the thread line, but then it makes, it can make more than 1/4 of an inch of the fabric unusable.
So we always have, so as Weeks was saying in the kits, if we know that you need 10 inches wide, we're giving you a half yard. There's always going to be excess, because the reality is, when you wash and dry, we always encourage pre-washing, the fabric will relax again, and it'll go back to its state. If it doesn't, you can kind of pull on it a little diagonally, but it wants to be in the perpendicular state that it was woven in. It's just those crazy machines, they just distort things.
And so I've had to explain to some people who, you know, don't have a textile background that fabric is not paper.
Yeah.
You know, it's not, it shifts and in the packaging process, and that's not something to worry about, because once you have it cut and in your and this is for prints too, it's just that, as Bill said, it's not as noticeable when it's not as directional, but we design to accommodate this, so don't freak out. Or I will say, if you freak out when you get a piece of fabric cut that's anywhere, then yarn dyes aren't for you. You know, because they're not going to, and that's not something in our control. But
and that's actually, it raises the whole question of when you work with yarn dyes and you have blocks that are square or rectangular, people are like, do I line up the stripes or the plaid to get it perfectly square? Do I have to do that? And the answer is no, it's your quilt. You choose what to do.
Well, but can we show this, hold this up?
Okay.
And you can see that we did not align.
Which one, the berry?
If you can hold that end.
Okay.
The second one down.
Can you see?
We did not match those plaids. And you don't notice.
They may be slightly off kilter.
Yeah.
But if that drives you crazy, then you can fussy cut. You can align everything. It's a personal choice. It's not a judgment.
At least it isn't from us.
No,
Yeah.
no. If it may be from a quilt judge somewhere, if you're, definitely if you're someone who's a competitive quilter, that's something to take into account. If you're just trying to make a comfortable quilt to use, let it go.
Or if you're buying yarn dyes for another pattern that's written for prints, you might want to buy a little bit more generously, knowing that if you're a person who wants to precisely match plaids, it's kind of like in garment patterns where they say, buy additional yardage required for directional fabrics.
Yeah, so for instance, the backing of this quilt, I'm holding it back away from the camera, and you can't see, this is actually two pieces seamed together. And I didn't want to have a jarring mismatch, so I cut a little extra. I aligned that buffalo check, and I actually pinned every couple inches. So it's not perfect, but it reads as one fabric. So knowing I needed that, I pre-washed probably an extra, quarter yard, probably just an extra 4 or 5 inches, which gave me the leeway to line that up. Again, that's a personal choice.
And if the direction issue is problematic for you, then stick with the smaller scale, like the mini ginghams, because you really don't need to match those ever.
And also stripes in general, because the stripe runs the length of the yardage in almost every case, it is very rarely distorted. A stripe is rarely distorted on the bolt. So the most noticeable are large plaids, large checks.
Right.
And that's it.
Yeah. So, and then another question we had was, how do you wash the final quilt once you're, there's a question about batting.
Oh, okay.
And we use the same batting. We use the quilter's
someone
green.
had a question, do you use different batting if you're using yarn dyes? And there's no need. Again, if you're using high quality yarn dyes, they should be just about the same weight as regular quilting cotton.
Right.
But going back, there are some lower quality, thinner ones on the market that you can kind of see through. And in that case, you may see the batting a bit through. I just wouldn't use those for a quilt.
Yeah.
I stick to that for lightweight apparel or other decorative work.
Or bags or something like that. But then the other question was, how do you wash finished quilts made with yarn dyes? And we wash them the same way with the ivory dishwashing liquid that we talk about in our YouTube tutorial. And again, we don't have any gig with
ivory. We just
ivory.
it just works well.
Well, it was recommended by the textile engineers for keeping that bond between the dye and the fabric, or in this case, the dye and the thread, to keeping that bond from fading. So if I rarely say never, but please don't use your awl or your Tide, or that's meant for removing stains
and oils.
So it's going to remove dye along with it.
Yeah, those are very harsh, and unless your quilt is really, really soiled and you have to do something, but even then, we prefer gentle soaps, which are different from detergents, and ivory is a soap. So one of the other things, can you, underneath that, there's a bottom quilt.
Oh, yes.
I want to, we were talking about how yarn dyes can be a bit different. And Weeks talked earlier about the weave, that they're ever so slightly less tightly woven than prints. It's just the way that the industry works. And because of that, there's a quilt that we made called Plaid Happy. And this is really interesting to do because it involves the use of curves. And if you've done any curved sewing, one of the nice things is having a little bias, a little stretch that helps you ease your curves. I mentioned earlier, it's harder to work with batiks when you're doing curves because they're so tightly woven. But if you're doing curves with yarn dyes, they are, boy, they're really forgiving. They have a nice stretch to them. I love using curves. So this Plaid Happy quilt, which is from, we did a publication called Warp and Weft that was, we released this with the initial line of yarn dyes that we did, and all the patterns in here can work with prints, but we wanted to feature the yarn dyes in there.
So Linda asked about pre-washing pre-cuts, and yes, I think you should. However, and I don't know whether you're talking about, like, certainly our fat quarter bundles, I would absolutely, there's nothing that I don't pre-wash, just because we had so many heartbreaking phone calls from people whose quilts have been ruined because they didn't. We've never once had somebody call in 21 years now, 22 years now. We've never had somebody call heartbroken because they pre-washed. Never. But we go through it we explain in the YouTube video on pre-cuts, on pre-washing, how we pre-wash pre-cuts. And typically we do it in a lingerie bag.
Yeah.
And the kind of soap is the Ivory Dishwashing Liquid. And we talk about, in that YouTube tutorial, about how much to use and all of that.
Yeah. But definitely the lingerie or delicates bag is great for pre-cuts.
Yeah.
And we do wash pre-cuts. We don't use pre-cuts a whole lot, but when we do wash them, whether it's kind of charm squares or 10 by 10s. The one exception could be if you're using long pre-cut strips.
Jelly rolls.
Jelly rolls, they are problematic to pre-wash. And you could always kind of just do them in a bathtub and let them dry.
That's what I would do.
I would say any form of agitation or tumbling, even in a front load machine, is going to cause problems, even in a lingerie bag. So I would avoid pre-washing those, or
Well, to me, and I guess I'll disagree with you.
Mm-hmm.
I would absolutely, because it isn't because they're jelly rolls that they're not going to bleed.
That's true.
So what I would do would be to if you have a bunch of jelly rolls, to put a little Ivory Dishwashing Liquid in a bucket and submerge them.
That's a good idea.
And leave them in there for a half an hour. And
just to make sure there's no bleeding.
Just to make sure that there's no fugitive dye that's going to wreck your quilt.
Yeah, that is better advice.
Yeah, and then, the other thing too is, if the pattern doesn't call for using them, salvage. If you can cut them in half, that's a lot less tangle that's going to happen.
Yeah. It's that tangle that you want to avoid. And actually, the use of delicates bags does make a big difference in that rarely do things tangle within them. They really do tame the washing.
One thing that we have discovered, though, with pre-washing charm squares, and I guess the 10 by 10s also, that is worth considering, is that fabrics are woven often with a different number of threads in the warp than in the weft.
Per inch. So, like, if you have, everyone knows from sheets, it's like, oh, is it 100 count, 300 count? With fabric, it's thicker cotton, so it's not that kind of density. But if you have something that is a 60 count, it actually might be 60 threads per inch in one direction and 50 in the other. So when it's on the bolt, unwashed, you cut a 3-inch square. Actually, let's say you cut a 10-inch square, it stays 10 inches. If you wash and dry a 10-inch square, it might shrink 1/8 of an inch in one direction and 1/4 of an inch in the other direction. So it's one of the reasons we pre-wash and dry all of our fabric before we cut it. So whatever shrinkage is going to happen has already happened.
Because if you're, we pre-washed some charm squares that were 5x5, and after we dried them, they were 4 1/4 by 4 3/4, or 4 1/2 by 4 3/4. But they were rectangles. They were no longer squares. And that's why I think manufacturers tell you not to pre-wash, is because they know that you're going to end up with a rectangle. But the reality is that the manufacturers are not going to be there if you have a bleeding quilt.
Or if you have a quilt that is shrunk in odd ways.
Right.
Remember, their goal is to sell you the fabric. Our goal is to help you make quilts you love that will last.
And to not have bleeding that happens.
So definitely, the pre-washing of charm squares is something, I would do it. Especially because a lot of pre-cuts are used in patterns that call for the exact size, and you may have to, if you find that there's odd shrinkage, you may have to tweak the pattern a little bit. It's meant to be a time saver, but in the end,
they can be problematic. But the one thing that I would also do when you're pre-washing pre-cuts is to use a wool dryer balls. And if you don't have these already, I encourage you to.
I'll grab them, because a lot of people have never seen them.
Yeah, we buy them and use them religiously, because they fluff up the fat quarters or the charm squares or whatever, so they don't clump together, which can sometimes happen when they might stick together in a bundle when you pull them out of the wash. But having the wool dryer balls in the drying cycle separates them and makes it easier for them to not get all kind of wrinkled. So ours are very
they've got a little bit of pilling and felting. But one of the nice things is that happens on the ball rather than on the fabric.
Yeah. But
we have, I don't remember, a half dozen of these,
you buy them
and they're lightweight. They'll last a lifetime.
Yeah. So let's see. I think we've gotten to everyone's questions. If there are any other questions, this would be a good time to ask. And we're going to have more projects made with our Warp and Weft holiday line. So check those out. What we love, and the whole concept behind this line, was we wanted, I was teaching in a shop in January one year, and I always go into the discount room to see what's there. And I saw in January a ton of Christmas fabric there, like a whole shelf of it. And I thought, that's a hard sell in January, because a lot of people don't want to start new Christmas themed fabrics projects then. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could have each individual print work on its own separately? So, for examble,
in January, it's just a beautiful red print.
Yeah.
This
red and blue, aqua, and gray and white.
I love this one.
Plaid. That doesn't look like a Christmas plaid.
So I'm going to edit this all and put this up. Thank you. We don't know what's going on with Facebook today because we've got a great connection.
Yeah.
But thanks for your patience, and I hope you learned a lot about yarn dyes.
And we'll give them a try.
Yeah. So take care.